The first time I noticed the doorways, I was looking at photographs of old European buildings. Massive wooden doors, 15 feet tall, set into stone frames that dwarfed the people standing beside them. I assumed they were decorative, ceremonial perhaps, built to impress visitors. But then I started measuring. The handles were positioned 8 feet off the ground. The steps leading up were twice the normal height. These doors were not built for show. They were built for use. And whoever used them was not the same size as us. That realization sent me down a path I never expected. The reports were everywhere once I started looking. Newspaper archives from the 1800s, digitized collections from historical societies, local records that had been sitting untouched for over a century. Account after account of giant human remains discovered during excavations across America. Not isolated incidents, not occasional curiosities. A pattern so consistent it defied coincidence. In 1883, workers digging near Clearwater, Minnesota, uncovered a burial site containing multiple skeletons. The smallest measured 7.5 feet. The largest exceeded 10. The local newspaper described the bones as unmistakably human in form, but impossible in scale. Skulls that could not fit in a normal man's hands. Jaws with double rows of teeth. Femurs thick as tree branches. We are told these accounts are exaggerations. Misidentified remains of mastodons or bears, confused by untrained observers. Tall tales invented by newspapers, hungry for sensational stories. The official explanation sounds reasonable until you read the actual reports. These were not farmers stumbling across strange bones in their fields. Many discoveries involved physicians, surveyors, and scientists who documented what they found in careful detail. They took measurements, they made drawings. They compared the remains to known human anatomy and concluded they were looking at something that should not exist. The Lovelock Cave discovery in Nevada, 1911. Workers harvesting bat guano for fertilizer broke through into a hidden chamber. Inside they found artifacts, tools, weapons, and human remains of unusual size. Red-haired mummies, some measuring over 8 feet tall. The local Paiute tribe had legends about these beings, giants who lived in the region long before their ancestors arrived. Red-haired cannibals who terrorized the native population until they were driven into caves and destroyed. The tribe called them the Site Shah. We are told the legends are mythology, oral traditions embellished over generations. But the bones matched the stories. The red hair was real, preserved in the dry cave environment. The size was documented by multiple witnesses. And then, like so many other discoveries, the remains were sent away for study and largely disappeared from public discussion. This happened repeatedly. Giant skeletons unearthed during railroad construction in Ohio. Enormous bones found while digging foundations in Wisconsin. Burial mounds opened to reveal remains that towered over the workers who excavated them. The newspapers reported these finds as matter of fact, treating them as curiosities worth a few paragraphs before moving on to other news. Nobody seemed to realize they were documenting evidence of something that would later be declared impossible. I spent months mapping the discoveries geographically. The pattern was striking. Giant remains concentrated heavily in the Ohio River Valley, the Great Lakes region, and along the Mississippi. The same areas where ancient mound-building civilizations had left their marks on the landscape. Massive earthworks, geometric enclosures, burial complexes that required enormous coordinated labor to construct. The official history credits these structures to Native American ancestors. Cultures that supposedly had no knowledge of giants and no contact with anything other than normal-sized human populations. But the bones tell a different story. Excavations of these mounds consistently yielded oversized remains. 7 feet, 8 feet, 9 feet and more. Skeletons buried with copper ornaments, mica sheets, and carved artifacts that suggested a sophisticated culture. The Smithsonian Institution sent expeditions to document these finds in the late 1800s. They collected thousands of artifacts and hundreds of skeletal remains. They published reports describing what they found. And then something changed. By the early 1900s, the reports of giant discoveries began to taper off. Not because the excavation stopped. Construction was booming, more earth was being moved than ever before. But somehow the giants stopped appearing, or stopped being reported. The earlier accounts were quietly reclassified, reinterpreted, or simply ignored. Textbooks made no mention of the oversized remains. Museum displays showed normal-sized skeletons. The giants had been erased from the acceptable historical narrative. I kept searching for explanations. Hoaxes, perhaps. The late 1800s saw plenty of fraudulent archaeological claims. But the sheer volume of reports made coordinated hoaxing implausible. Dozens of newspapers across multiple states would have needed to independently fabricate similar stories over decades. Misidentification seemed equally unlikely when physicians and trained observers were involved in the documentation. The simplest explanation was the most disturbing. The giants were real. They were found exactly where the reports said they were found. And someone decided that information needed to disappear. Here is where the evidence becomes truly unsettling. These discoveries were not limited to America. Reports of giant remains surface in historical records from every inhabited continent. Ireland, where construction projects unearthed enormous bones attributed to legendary races. South America, where Spanish conquistadors documented encounters with populations of exceptional size. The Middle East, where archaeological excavations revealed burials containing skeletons far larger than modern humans. The same pattern repeated everywhere. Discoveries made, documented, reported. Then silence. The remains sent to institutions for study and never discussed again. The accounts relegated to footnotes and obscure archives. A global phenomenon treated as though it never happened. I started connecting dates. The majority of American giant discoveries occurred during a specific period, the 1870s through the early 1900s. This was not coincidental. This was the era of massive construction projects, railroad expansion, urban development. Workers were digging deeper and more extensively than ever before in American history. They were reaching depths that had remained undisturbed for centuries. They were digging down to the level where things had been buried. The same level where old bridges show their hidden foundations. The same stratum where European cities find their original street surfaces. The same depth, roughly 3 to 5 meters below current ground level, that appears again and again when excavations uncover evidence of an older world. The giants were not found scattered randomly through the soil. They were found at a specific depth, the depth of the mud flood. The connection between giants and the mud flood changed everything I thought I understood. These were not separate mysteries. They were pieces of the same puzzle, a civilization buried under meters of sediment, and its inhabitants erased from history along with its infrastructure. I started examining the architectural evidence more carefully. Old buildings, the ones that survived from before the catastrophe, display features that make no sense for normal human proportions. Doorways 15 feet tall with handles positioned 8 feet off the ground. Staircases with treads so deep and risers so high that climbing them feels awkward for anyone under 6 feet. Windows placed at heights that would require a ladder to look through. Ceilings soaring 20 feet or more in buildings that served everyday functions, not cathedrals or palaces. We are told these proportions were aesthetic choices. grand entrances meant to impress visitors, high ceilings for ventilation and temperature control, oversized furniture built for display rather than use. The explanations sound plausible in isolation. But when you measure the proportions systematically, when you calculate the ergonomics, they describe spaces designed for beings significantly larger than modern humans. Look at the old photographs from the 1800s showing people inside these buildings. The humans look small, not just because of the grand architecture. They look like children in spaces built for adults. Chairs they cannot sit in comfortably, desks that reach their chests, doorknobs at shoulder height. The proportions are wrong in a way that becomes obvious once you know what to look for. The Tartarian Empire appears in old maps and encyclopedias from the 1700s and early 1800s. A vast civilization spanning much of Asia and extending into Europe and North America. Official history claims Tartaria was simply a geographic term, a vague designation for unexplored territories. We are told there was no unified Tartarian civilization, no advanced Tartarian technology, no Tartarian people distinct from the populations we know today. But the maps show cities, named cities with detailed positions, trade routes connecting them, political boundaries that suggest organized governance. The encyclopedias describe Tartarian culture, architecture, and achievements. And then, sometime in the mid-1800s, Tartaria disappears from the maps entirely. A civilization covering half the world, simply erased. Replaced by the nations we recognize today, with histories that conveniently begin after the catastrophe. The giants were Tartarian. That is the conclusion the evidence points toward. A race of larger humans who built the infrastructure we find buried beneath modern cities, who constructed the massive stone bridges now sinking into the earth, who designed buildings with proportions that dwarfed their current inhabitants. They were wiped out by the mud flood, buried along with their cities, and systematically removed from historical memory. The Smithsonian Institution sits at the center of this erasure. Founded in 1846, just as the construction boom was beginning to unearth evidence of the buried world. The institution collected giant remains from excavation sites across America. Crates of bones shipped to Washington for study and preservation. Official expeditions documented the discoveries, photographed the skeletons, recorded the measurements. And then the bones vanished. Researchers who have tried to locate these remains in Smithsonian archives find nothing. Records that should exist are missing. Catalog entries that reference giant skeletons lead to empty shelves. Freedom of information requests return denials or heavily redacted documents. The institution that was supposed to preserve American archaeological heritage appears to have deliberately destroyed or hidden evidence of giant human remains. This was not accidental. This was not bureaucratic incompetence. The pattern is too consistent, too thorough. Someone made a decision that the giants could not be part of the accepted historical narrative. Someone with enough institutional power to remove physical evidence from museums, suppress academic research, and control what appeared in textbooks. The cover-up was systematic and global. I found similar patterns in European institutions. Giant remains discovered during construction projects in England, Germany, France. Bones sent to national museums for study. Records of their arrival documented in institutional correspondence. And then silence. The remains never displayed. The documentation buried in restricted archives. Researchers denied access without explanation. The architectural evidence could not be hidden as easily. The buildings still stand. The giant doorways are still there, converted now into decorative facades or bricked partially closed to create normal-sized entrances. The massive staircases remain, though modern buildings often install smaller steps alongside them. The oversized furniture appears in antique collections, labeled as ceremonial or decorative pieces because nobody wants to consider the obvious alternative. Walk through the old quarters of any European city and you will see it. Buildings where the first-floor windows sit at what is now basement level, their original entrances buried meters underground. Doorways that were clearly functional, built for daily use, but sized for beings 9 or 10 feet tall. Stone lintels with wear patterns that show where enormous hands gripped them for generations. The evidence is everywhere, hiding in plain sight. I began measuring systematically. Standard human ergonomics suggest optimal door heights of 7 to 8 feet for populations averaging around 6 feet tall. The old doors, the original doors on buildings from before the catastrophe, consistently measure 12 to 16 feet. That ratio suggests a population averaging 9 to 10 feet in height, exactly matching the skeletal remains found in excavations, exactly matching the proportions described in newspaper accounts. The architecture and the bones tell the same story. Here is what keeps me awake at night. If the giants were real, if they built the civilization we find buried, if they were systematically erased from history, then everything we believe about human progress is wrong. We are not the most advanced humans who ever lived. We are the survivors. The inheritors of ruins we do not understand, living in buildings we did not build, walking over the bones of a race we have been taught never existed. Almost as if someone does not want us to know what came before. Almost as if the truth about our past is too dangerous to remember. The timeline contradictions are staggering when you examine them closely. Official history tells us that human height has remained relatively constant for thousands of years. Minor variations between populations, gradual increases with improved nutrition, but nothing that would account for 9-foot skeletons. We are told that anatomically modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years, and none of them were giants. But the newspaper accounts are from the 1800s, not ancient history, not mythological time, within 2 centuries of where we stand today. Educated observers, physicians, scientists, journalists documented what they found. They took measurements. They made comparisons. They wrote reports that were published and distributed to readers who accepted giant skeletons as interesting facts rather than impossible fantasies. The shift happened within a single generation. In 1880, finding giant bones was newsworthy, but not controversial. By 1920, the same discovery would have been dismissed as hoax or error before investigation even began. Something changed in those 40 years. Not the evidence. The interpretation, the acceptable boundaries of what could be true were redrawn, and everything outside those boundaries was retroactively declared impossible. I traced the academic literature through this transition period. The early anthropological journals discussed giant remains matter-of-factly. They debate origins, speculate about causes, argue about classification. Normal scientific discourse about anomalous evidence. Then the tone shifts. References to giants become hedged with disclaimers. Then mocking. Then absent entirely. By mid-century, any academic who mentioned giant skeletons would risk career destruction. The topic became unmentionable through a process that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with institutional control. Think about what that means. An entire category of physical evidence, documented by hundreds of independent witnesses across decades and continents, was declared non-existent through social pressure rather than scientific refutation. No researcher published findings that explained the skeletal remains as misidentified animal bones. No systematic study demonstrated the newspaper accounts were fabricated. The giants simply became impossible because the institutions that control historical narrative decided they were impossible. The same institutions that collected the bones, the same institutions that controlled the archives, the same institutions that wrote the textbooks. If they lied about the giants, what else are they lying about? The question haunts me now. Every historical fact I accepted without question has become suspect. Every confident assertion in every textbook feels like potential deception. Not because I have evidence that everything is false, but because I have evidence that systematic falsification is possible, has happened, continues to operate. The buried infrastructure, the giant remains. The erased civilization, they connect into a picture that inverts everything we think we know about human progress. We are told that history is a story of advancement. Primitive ancestors gradually developing technology, building civilization, improving generation after generation until we reached our current pinnacle. Each era more sophisticated than the last. Each century bringing humanity closer to its potential. But what if we are not advancing? What if we are recovering? What if the civilization before the mud flood was more advanced than ours, not less? The precision stonework, the sophisticated engineering, the global infrastructure network, the beings capable of building it, all buried, all erased, all replaced by a degraded remnant population picking through ruins and pretending they built what they found. Maybe that is exactly why this information has been suppressed. Because if people knew there was a reset, if they understood that advanced civilizations can be destroyed and forgotten within generations, it would shatter the mythology of progress. It would force questions about stability, about permanence, about whether everything we have built could disappear as completely as what came before. The giants did not survive the catastrophe. Or if some did, they did not survive what came after. A population already devastated by cataclysm, then systematically hunted or displaced by the smaller humans who emerged to inherit the ruins. The skeletal evidence suggests violence, bones with marks of trauma, burials that look hasty, desperate. Whatever happened to the giants, it was not peaceful decline. And then even their memory was taken from them, their bones confiscated, their buildings occupied by those who could not have constructed them, their civilization attributed to the ancestors of their replacements, or declared to have never existed at all. Genocide followed by historical annihilation. Erased so thoroughly that questioning their non-existence marks you as delusional. I look at old buildings differently now. The massive doorways, the impossible staircases, the proportions that make no sense for humans our size. I see ghosts in the architecture, the shadows of beings who walked through those doors, climbed those stairs, lived in those spaces before the mud came, before the survivors came, before the forgetting began. The bones are still there, buried in museum basements if they were not destroyed, hidden in private collections if they escaped institutional confiscation, lying undiscovered in remote locations where excavation has not yet reached. The evidence exists. It has been suppressed, ridiculed, denied, but not completely eliminated. Every construction project that digs below modern street level risks uncovering what was buried. Every archive that opens its restricted collections might reveal what was hidden. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The giant doorways you walk past without noticing. The buried foundations visible in excavation photographs. The newspaper accounts digitized and searchable by anyone willing to look. The pattern is there, documented, preserved despite every effort to erase it. The giants lived. They built. They were destroyed. And we walk over their bones every day, never knowing what lies beneath our feet, never asking why we were taught to believe they never existed, never wondering what else has been buried, physically and historically, to keep us from understanding what this world was before we inherited its ruins. The truth is still down there, waiting, silent and patient as stone.